Welcome back to the channel. Today's emotional family story follows Anny, a devoted single mother whose greatest joy in life is her 8-year-old son, Ethan. Ever since Ethan was born, Anny had noticed that her wealthy parents treated him differently from the other grandchildren. Whenever the family gathered for birthdays, holidays, or celebrations, the other children received expensive gifts, warm hugs, and endless praise, while Ethan was often ignored or given whatever was left over. Anny tried convincing herself that she was imagining things because she wanted her son to grow up surrounded by family rather than bitterness. One evening, her parents invited everyone to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary at the city's most luxurious steakhouse. Excitement spread through the family group chat as everyone discussed the elegant restaurant, famous for serving premium steaks costing over $120 each. Since the restaurant required advance reservations, Anny's mother proudly announced that she had already pre-ordered special steaks for every grandchild so they would have the best dining experience. Ethan's eyes sparkled when Anny read the message aloud. It would be his first time eating at such a famous restaurant, and he couldn't stop talking about wearing his favorite blue shirt. Wanting the evening to be perfect, Anny bought him new shoes and even worked extra hours to afford a nice dress for herself. She believed this dinner might finally prove that her parents accepted Ethan as an equal. On the night of the celebration, the restaurant glittered with crystal chandeliers and soft music. Family members laughed while waiters carried elegant plates to the table. One by one, the children received enormous sizzling steaks prepared exactly as requested. Ethan watched with growing excitement, expecting his meal to arrive next. Instead, the waiter placed a small plate of plain pasta in front of him. Thinking it was a mistake, Anny politely asked where Ethan's steak was. The waiter glanced nervously at his order sheet before quietly explaining that only the other grandchildren had premium meals reserved. Ethan had been listed separately with the cheaper children's menu. The restaurant suddenly felt silent to Anny even though everyone else continued eating. Ethan looked at his mother with confused eyes and whispered, "Mom, did they forget about me?" Before Anny could answer, her mother casually smiled and said, "He's still young. A steak that expensive would be wasted on him." Several relatives avoided eye contact while others laughed awkwardly. Tears filled Ethan's eyes as he stared at the plain pasta. Anny felt heartbreak turn into anger. She gently pushed her chair back, stood beside her son, and said calmly, "If my child isn't worthy of sitting at this table as family, then neither am I." Holding Ethan's hand, she walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Outside, Ethan apologized, believing he had done something wrong. Kneeling beside him, Anny hugged him tightly and promised that none of this was his fault. She told him that his value would never be measured by the price of a meal or by the opinions of people who refused to love him equally. That night, instead of crying, Anny made a quiet promise to herself. She would stop chasing her family's approval and begin building a better life for Ethan, even if it meant leaving behind the people who shared her last name. Neither of them realized that just 2 weeks later, an unexpected event would completely change the balance of power in the family and force everyone to face the consequences of the cruel choice they had made. 2 weeks passed after the humiliating dinner, and although the memory still hurt, Anny refused to let bitterness control her life. Instead of dwelling on the painful evening, she focused on giving Ethan the love and confidence he deserved. Every afternoon after school, they spent time together cooking dinner, playing board games, and talking about their dreams. Ethan slowly stopped asking why his grandparents treated him differently, but Anny could still see the sadness hidden behind his smile. She promised herself that no matter what happened, her son would always know he was deeply loved. Meanwhile, the rest of the family continued as if nothing had happened. No one called to apologize. No one checked on Ethan. The silence spoke louder than words. Then, one Monday morning, Anny received an unexpected phone call from an attorney representing her late Aunt Margaret, a woman who had lived overseas for many years. Although the rest of the family rarely visited Margaret because she wasn't wealthy in their eyes, Anny had stayed in touch, calling her every week and helping her whenever she could. During difficult times, Margaret often told Annie that kindness was worth more than money. The lawyer asked Annie to attend the reading of Margaret's will later that week. Curious but expecting nothing, Annie agreed. On Friday, the entire family gathered at the attorney's office, confident they would receive generous inheritances. Annie's parents arrived wearing expensive clothes and whispered excitedly about vacation homes and investment accounts. Some cousins even argued over who deserved Margaret's antique jewelry before the meeting had begun. When the lawyer entered the room, he thanked everyone for coming and began reading the will. Margaret had left several personal gifts to relatives, but when it came to the largest part of her estate, the room fell completely silent. The lawyer announced that Margaret had left her beautiful lakeside home, her savings, and a successful rental property business entirely to Annie and Ethan. Gasps echoed throughout the room. Annie herself looked stunned, believing she had heard incorrectly. The lawyer then unfolded a handwritten letter from Margaret. In it, Margaret explained that she had watched how the family judged people by wealth instead of character. She wrote that Annie had always shown genuine kindness without expecting anything in return and that Ethan had the purest heart she had ever known. Margaret said she wanted her life's work to support the people who valued love over money. Tears filled Annie's eyes as the lawyer finished reading. Across the room, her parents' faces turned pale. The same relatives who had ignored Ethan at the restaurant suddenly smiled at him and tried starting friendly conversations. One cousin joked that they should all have a family barbecue together. Another suggested planning holidays as one big happy family again. Annie recognized the sudden change immediately. It wasn't love that had appeared overnight, it was greed. Over the next several days, her phone rang constantly. Her mother apologized for the steak incident, insisting it had been a misunderstanding. Her father invited Ethan to go fishing together for the first time in years. Relatives sent gifts, expensive toys, and heartfelt messages claiming they had always cared. Ethan innocently asked whether Grandma loved him now. Annie hugged him gently and explained that real love doesn't appear only after money arrives. She wanted her son to understand the difference between sincere affection and selfish interest. Instead of responding with anger, Annie remained polite but kept her distance. She thanked people for their messages without accepting their sudden affection. As she organized the inheritance and prepared to manage Margaret's rental properties, she quietly honored her aunt's final wish by creating a college fund for Ethan and planning a small charity program to help struggling single parents. The family believed they could eventually convince Annie to share her inheritance, but they had no idea she had already made a life-changing decision that would finally reveal the true cost of treating one innocent child as if he didn't belong. As the weeks passed, Annie settled into her new responsibilities with quiet determination. She worked hard to manage Aunt Margaret's rental properties honestly and efficiently, ensuring every tenant was treated with fairness and respect. The income allowed her to provide Ethan with opportunities she had only dreamed about before. She enrolled him in a better school, encouraged his love of science, and created a warm, peaceful home where laughter replaced tears. Most importantly, she never allowed money to change her values. She reminded Ethan every day that kindness, integrity, and compassion were far more valuable than wealth. Meanwhile, the rest of the family grew increasingly frustrated. Their gifts, invitations, and apologies had failed to bring Annie back into their circle. Finally, her parents organized a large family dinner and personally invited Annie and Ethan, insisting they wanted to make things right. After thinking carefully, Annie accepted, not because she expected an apology, but because she wanted Ethan to see that forgiveness did not mean forgetting the lessons of the past. When they arrived, the atmosphere felt strangely familiar. The same relatives who had ignored Ethan now rushed over with smiles, hugs, and compliments. Ethan was offered the best seat at the table, expensive desserts, and even a beautifully wrapped gift. Annie watched quietly, noticing how easily people changed when money entered the picture. Before dinner was served, her father stood and cleared his throat. In front of everyone, he admitted that the family had treated Ethan unfairly for years. He apologized for excluding him from the steak dinner and confessed that they had allowed pride and favoritism to blind them.